February is known as President's Day, or in February we celebrate President's Day. When I was a lad, it was George Washington's birthday we celebrated. Then it went to combining Lincoln and Washington in February, and now it's President's Day. Lincoln has been put on the same pedestal as George Washington, one of the founding fathers of what is now the United States. Lincoln has also been done with, he was a great humanitarian and he freed the slaves. I hate to disappoint you folks, he didn't. Lincoln was a protege of Alexander Hamilton and Henry Clay, who believed in a strong central government, versus Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, George Washington, who believed in a strong or a weak federal government and strong state governments. This is the battle that started from the very beginning of the founding of the fathers. If you've heard any of my talks, I end up back with them, because that's where it all started. This country was split from the start. You hear a lot about Lincoln being this poor, common man struggling to get along. Perhaps in the beginning. I mean, I won't dispute he probably lived in a log cabin in Illinois, his home state. Maybe he did study his law books or whatever by the flaming fireplace. But he was far from being poor. He was quite a wealthy lawyer, and at the time, starting in almost 1832, he was the corporate lawyer of the day, what little corporations there were at the time. In particular, he was the railroad's go-to attorney. As a senator, he also belonged to the Whig Party, which was also the party of this great centralized government. And he believed in the American system that they so named, of this strong, dictatorial, almost king-like government coming out of Washington, D.C. The Whig Party converted into the Republican Party, and that's where Lincoln became a Republican. He also belonged to the American Colonization Society. This society pushed to have blacks, free or otherwise, pushed out of the United States and colonized somewhere else. In fact, the American Colonization Society funded the startup of a country called Liberia. Lincoln didn't care where they go as long as they went. So, it sounds like he was really for the black guy, doesn't it? He also supported the fugitive slave laws. These laws said that if you caught a runaway slave, you had to return him to the rightful owner. He was a strong supporter of that. His home state, Illinois, that he supported, changed their constitution to outlaw any blacks in their state or territory as it was at the time. Upon the advent of secession, that Lincoln said he was start a war to save the Union. He even admitted to Horace Greeley, a big newspaper guy at the time, that if he could save the Union without freeing one slave, he would. He claimed secession was illegal, as did the Republican Party and people of the Hamiltonian and Clay deal. But let me clue you, this is not the case. At the Hartford Convention in 1814 and 1815, the New England states were considering seceding because they didn't like the way the country was going. They were Massachusetts was going to secede in 1807 because of the Embargo Act. Also the War of 1812. Massachusetts and several other states said we may want to out. And then the annexation of Texas that didn't go well with some of the northern states. So you see, secession was legal up until 1860. Most people don't realize that. The South had a perfect right to secede. Now, in all this political things that have gone on to justify bringing the southern states back into the Union, they claimed that the Union, and they started this dialogue, the Union created the states. Nothing could be further from the truth. The states formed the federal government as their agent for specific items. The rest was left to the states to decide on their own that they could do what they wanted. States' rights. In fact, the state senators, until 1913, were appointed by the state legislatures. So the states, up until 1913, had a voice in the federal government. Lincoln ignored all that. All you people think he was a great humanitarian and a great uniter? Maybe you're right. I don't agree. As far as the war that he started. He antagonized the state of South Carolina over Fort Sumter. He knew that if he sent a ship in loaded with goods and soldiers, the Southerners in South Carolina were going to fire on it. He knew that. They were attempting to purchase Fort Sumter from the federal government. They felt it was theirs and they had a right to secede. You think about Massachusetts, you think about New England states and others. That was true at the time. They had a right to say, we've had enough. In fact, the founding fathers liked the idea of secession because it would keep the federal government or this federal agency that they designed in check, knowing that if they misbehaved too bad, they could split the Union and possibly lose a lot of their power. Lincoln antagonized the South to blame them on starting the Civil War. He knew exactly what he was doing. He was a great politician and a great orator. He also made the statement that if any state refused to collect tariffs of the time, that he would use military force to collect those tariffs. This meant anybody. This was dictated. If you don't give me your money, I'm coming after you. Other things that Lincoln did at the start of the hostilities was to imprison the legislature of Maryland that had been duly elected by the state of Maryland before they even took office. Lincoln also used military force against newspapers that would print any article that they disagreed with him. This sounds like a great guy, doesn't it? He did it. Do your research. It's there. Over 300 newspapers were forced to close down. He even held elections in northern states that was somewhat swayed by the military being at the voting polls to make sure the votes went the right way. He also annexed the state of West Virginia into the Union illegally because he needed or felt he needed electoral votes to win another election. Sounds like this great uniter, this great humanitarian, this great statesman did it. In fact, there was a senator out of Ohio, and this was Senator, and I won't spell his name, Vallandigham, who ended up being deported because he was a fierce opponent of Lincoln and Lincoln's tactics. Keep in mind, Lincoln trashed the Constitution. He cared less about it. It was in his way. And he used force of military, even in the North, to secure his position as president. Now, coming to the War of the South, Lincoln was a micromanager. He used the telegraph very effectively. In fact, more effectively than the South. The South lagged behind, unfortunately, on using the telegraph. But he was in touch with all his generals and all their campaigns almost on a daily basis. He proposed and allowed the military, the Union Army, to destroy public lands and take private property and abuse citizens. At that time, warfare was more than likely done on a military battlefield. He turned the tide and decided to use the military on anybody that would succeed or disagree with him, including women, children, old men, whether black or white, he didn't care. Remember, Lincoln did not care for the black people. In fact, he called at the outset of hostilities 4 prominent black men to the White House to try to convince them to be leaders of their race and move to Liberia or some other continent and set up their own government. He also told them in this meeting, and it's public accord if you dig into it, that he felt the 2 races would never, ever get along. As far as slavery goes, the North had more slaves at one time than the Southerners did. They eventually got away from them by selling them to Southerners. Wow, sold them for money, medium of exchange. The Northern people did not adhere to the blacks. They thought they were downclassed. They thought they were inferior. They thought they were worthless human beings. Very similar to what our wonderful federal government did to the Native Americans, particularly the Cherokee, the Creek, and the Choctaws from the southern states. Remember the Trail of Tears. They thought the same about it. They thought nothing of abusing slaves, their slaves. Where in the South, since most of the slave owners only owned 4 to 6, the slaves were treated more like family. This has been concurred by several European writers and authors who came over to investigate the treatment of blacks on the U.S., what is now the U.S. continent. Could the slaves have been freed without such harsh warfare? Sure, and let me read you some countries that did it without any shed of blood. Argentina did it in 1813. Colombia did it in 1814. Chile, 1823. Central America, 1824. Mexico, 1829. Bolivia, 1831. Uruguay, 1842. French and Danish colonies, 1848. Ecuador, 1851. Peru, 1854. Venezuela, 1854. These countries, including Britain had also done away with slavery. They did so without shedding blood. And when I mean shedding blood, Lincoln's War cost 650,000 soldiers' lives, and that's the current count to date that I can find. I think it's going to be a lot more before people quit digging. On top of that, 250,000 civilians were killed, maimed, or whatever. So you're talking 900,000, almost 1 million American lives at the hands of Lincoln which was not about slavery, as I had said. He could have cared less about the blacks. He wanted them gone. Lincoln's cost to force the southern colonies back into the Union so he could collect tariffs at their port. Money war. Not only did Lincoln's war cost lives, between the two battling countries, if you will, at a cost of $6.5 billion that I can dig out. And think about that. $6.5 billion, the cost of the Lincoln's War, as I will call it, could have bought every slave and gave them 40 acres of land with money left over. Another thing you don't hear about Lincoln, and as I said at the start, that he was a corporate lawyer, particularly the railroads. In this, he believed in improvements, or what at the time I guess comes under the General Welfare Clause, is still being used, that the federal government should contribute to improvements. He used that philosophy, even though he was spending tons of money on an illegal war, to fund the Transcontinental Railroad for the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific Railroads. Keep in mind, he was their attorney. There was another transcontinental railroad done by a gentleman in the name of Hill, who used private funding, did so effectively, efficiently, and profitably. Lincoln, using federal funds to support the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific Transcontinental Railroad, was plagued with cost overruns and money disappearing and inefficient methods. Kind of sounds familiar to what we have today, doesn't it? Martin Marietta, Lockheed, Boeing, military-industrial complex. Think about it. You may not agree with it, but it does have a factor that we're still fighting today. In the meantime, at the end of the Transcontinental Railroad, when they drove the Gold Spike, the Union Pacific and Central Pacific filed bankruptcy. Hill's Transcontinental Railroad was operating profitably. Just another point of Lincoln. So as we celebrate President's Day, and you people honor Lincoln and think he was a great humanitarian and great uniter, he was anything but that. He trashed the Constitution. He cost hundreds of thousands of lives. He cost billions of dollars just to force a united federation without state support, and crushed or put a big dent into the Jeffersonian philosophy of states' rights and a limited federal government. Roosevelt followed suit in the 1930s. Prior to Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson threw some darts at states' rights. In fact, he got us into the World War I when he did not have to. He wanted the war because it helped him proceed with his, I'll call it a liberal agenda, strong central government agenda, less states' rights agenda, whatever you want to call it. Some historians have done some research and have come to the conclusion that World War I would have ended without the United States even entering it, and things would have worked out just as well as it did with the United States entering it. But back to Lincoln. Lincoln was a protege of Alexander Hamilton, Henry Clay, the American system of a strong, very strong, centralized government, and the states really did not have any rights. Think about what's going on today when you look at the presidential debates and the upcoming election. Some of the same arguments that forced the Southerners into seceding are going on today. Between Lincoln, Wilson, Roosevelt, even LBJ and his Great Society that has tried to remove any aspect of states' rights, some of the battles are still going on. So today, in Lincoln today, if you want to worship him and think he's next to George Washington and walks on water, have fun. I do not think he was a great liberator. I do not think he was a great humanitarian. And I definitely don't think that he freed the slaves. I think he was one of the cruelest, meanest presidents this country has ever had, and we're still paying the price. So in this President's Day, do as you wish. God bless your pea-picking heart. But as far as I'm concerned, Lincoln can go to, well, you figure it out.